Good afternoon. We welcome to the Iowa Family Support Credential webinar for the month of August. We're looking at Standard 14 today. Standard 14 is a standard that involves lots of different things. And so we're going to dive right in because today is going to take us a bit probably to get through all of the different subjects as we kind of skip through some things. So our first thing we always talk about, the difference between policy and procedure, just so that we can make sure we're on the same page about what those things mean as we go through today's webinar, and as you begin to apply that to the work that you're doing as you're preparing for the Iowa Family Support Credential. So policy, when we say policy, what we mean is a pretty broad statement. Generally, we're looking at what or why you do something. And, oftentimes the policy is going to sound a lot like the standard. We do this, we do assessments, maybe these are the assessments we do, but it doesn't really get very specific. Maybe you talk about why, something is important, what value it adds, those kinds of things. But, that's your policy. Those things don't change very often. The procedure is where things get a little bit more narrow in application. For procedure, it's statements of how or when or who, where it's documented. Those are the things that might change more often. As you decide to do something more often, less often, you change a form. Maybe the position that does that changes. Maybe it was done originally by the family support professional. Now it's going to be a supervisor that does that. Those things are really specific in detail and should, kind of specify that process or protocol. So 1, do this, 2, do this, 3, do this. That's one way of setting it up is like that 1, 2, 3, 4 kind of by step process. I've seen a lot of programs do that here lately, and they've been really successful in doing it that way. Those things usually don't need board approval. And as we're trying to, build programs to prepare for including this in their stuff that they submit for the Iowa Family Support Credential, you'll see this logo, this IFSC procedure boost, and that's kind of that extra little stuff that maybe you don't have before, but now you need to start adding because those things are required. The other thing that we talk about at the beginning of every webinar is making sure that you're including the revision dates on policies and procedures. This is required for programs, but I know that a lot of programs are still struggling to get systems for implementing this into place. Especially it will be required for programs that are going through an expedited review or an expedited renewal. We need to be able to know which standards or which policies have been changed since the last peer review, and then what subsequent standards that relates to. So there's 2 kind of ways to do it. You can track it. This top version is right there on the policy or procedure. You can kind of note it right there. The name, it talks about the dates that it originally went into effect, the date it was revised. That's right on there on every policy or procedure. Another way to do it is to track it outside of the procedure itself in a spreadsheet where you document it each time that it's, the effective date each time it was revised. Seen programs do it both ways. It works really great. For programs that have access to software that tracks that for you, that's fine. Just need to see like a report or evidence of that when we're talking about that renewal. And then this is just another kind of, it's a visual representation of that policy versus procedure. Some people are more visual, and so this is what appeals to my brain, but I get it. It's kind of messy to other people's. But that policy is broad. So under one policy, there might be multiple different procedures. It might depend on, the department. And then within a department, it might depend on funders, different ways of doing things depending on the funder. Maybe you receive both shared visions funding or ICAP funding in addition to ECI funding, in addition to United Way funding, and they all require slightly different things. And so you might have to tweak things and do things a little differently between funders, and so different policies or different procedures speak to different funders. All right, so we're going to dig in. We are ready to go on standard 14, which is personnel. The first order standard, or the first order, wording for this standard is personnel are capable of helping children and families consider options, improve their functioning, and achieve their goals. So everything we talk about for the rest of this webinar will kind of support that and come up underneath that. And there's a couple of different ways in the Iowa Family Support Standards that go about it, talking about competencies, talking about educational requirements, talking about the components of supervision, and talking about case collaboration with other service providers. So those are all kind of subjects we're going to touch on today. A note, first of all, about standard 14. When we say personnel, that is a comprehensive word to include family support professionals, supervisors who provide administrative supervision and family level supervision to those family support professionals. And then also sometimes program management as applicable. I know not every program has a supervisor and a program manager. I know though that we have all kinds of different setups in all kinds of programs across the state. And so that might be a position that doesn't always exist everywhere. But then also, program manager might be that person who provides supervision to the supervisor who also carries a caseload. And so when we're talking through 14 today, what we're really including in there is all the individuals who are in positions that are listed on the staffing grid, which is something we complete together at the beginning of TA. So for programs that haven't done that before or don't know what the staffing grid is, know that we'll start talking about it at the beginning of TA. Actually, you complete your initial staffing grid as an application for renewal or an application to start the original credential now for the Iowa Family Support credential. And standard 14 does kind of fluctuate in who it's applicable to. Overall, there are pieces or components of the standard that is applicable to all types of programs found within the Iowa Family Support Standards: long-term home visitations with group components, without group components, group-based parent education programs, and short-term home visitation programs. So our first couple standards here are going to be related to competencies. So we're going to dig in here on competencies, and then we'll shift gears to something completely different after that. So standards 1401, 1402, and 1403 are all competencies that apply to different staff and different programs and those kinds of things. So as we go through these, you really want to pay attention to the applicable section down there to know if that's going to apply to your specific program. So this one is personnel have the competencies needed to, and it walks through a lot of different competencies. I'm not going to read them all off to you, but these relate to home visitation competencies, home visitor competencies, people that are working in a long-term home visitation program. And when we say competencies, I know we have the competency-based assessment with the Institute and the Certified Family Support Professional. Great if you've already, most programs have already integrated that into their planning, and they have people who have gone through that and are now certified. And that's fantastic because that is going to work in here really nicely. You can use that for a lot of these competencies. But it will require you to go through and kind of look at the competencies that are on that and line them up with the competencies that are here. And the other thing I want to say here is that competency can be demonstrated through a combination of experience, training, or education, training, and experience. Most of the time, we see it through one of two things, really. Most of the time, it'll be based on like an observation of a competency, like a supervisor watches somebody do this multiple times and can say, "Yep, we're good. I know that person has that competency." But what really happens the most is it's based on a training. So we'll talk through kind of how you'll want to structure that as you build in your policy and procedure, but just kind of keep that in mind. So for this one, policy and procedure is really going to be very similar. I don't want you to write a policy that says these are all the things we do, and just have it look exact, all of the competencies that our staff have, and have that just be the standard, right? Because that's what it would be. It would be pretty much the standard. So, and this one, policy and procedure are kind of integrated more than you would see that on maybe other standards, or that's how it makes the most sense in my brain to look. And that's what a successful implementation of it looks like. But things to kind of think about here. So, what does the program's training plan look like? How do you have a training plan? We're going to talk through that, because I think that is like foundational to this one. What competencies does that include? Be specific, like down to the app, like as specific as the standard requires. Who is involved in the process? When are those competency observations or competency, like a training for those competencies? When are they due? Where is everything documented? And then just kind of a hint here that every competency needs to be addressed. I know, I hear sometimes where it's like, well, duh, yes, of course we have staff that have these competencies. And I totally believe you, but like, the inner CQI person in me wants to say, but how do you know? How do you know for sure? How do you know that person that you hired, that looks like they maybe do have all of this great experience or this great education, but how do you know that they have the ability to engage families and work with families in a way that is collaborative? And how do you know? I always think back to when I worked in a program and I would hire somebody out of college, and they would have all the necessary things on their transcript. Yeah, they had these classes, and maybe even they had a little bit of like shadowing where they got to go and watch, be a part of or observe in some instances various things. But like, how do you know? How have you seen them demonstrate their skills? And that's even partially true out of training. Just because you take a training on something doesn't necessarily mean that you're competent in it. You've heard somebody tell you how to do it, but you've not done it. So that's kind of some things to think through too as you're working on your policy and procedure for this one. So foundationally, when you have a new staff member come in, how do you know what they need to do to do their job? How does the supervisor know? How does the program manager know? What's that like day one? This is what you're going to be doing over the course of the next week, month, year, to get you fully trained. This is all the stuff we need to check in on, make sure that you know how to do all of these things. It sounds, actually to me, it sounds kind of overwhelming, and maybe that doesn't sound overwhelming to everyone, but these competencies are really foundational to having a quality family support professional, but then also to having quality programming. If you've got a program that doesn't have staff that have these competencies, chances are you're kind of seeing some of those things in your outcomes. And even if you've got somebody that's been there for 10 years, maybe they need some extra support in some of those competencies. So make sure you're addressing every competency. These competencies apply to every position. So on that staffing grid we talked about earlier, if you've got your family support professionals, your supervisors, your program management, anybody that's involved in directly providing services to families or supervising anyone who provides direct services to families, and that could include supervisors who carry a caseload. So anybody in either of those two situations has to be included in here. They have to have all of these competencies and documentation for these competencies that they've been met. And in those instances, if you've got a supervisor who carries a caseload, who supervises them on that caseload? They can't supervise themselves. They have to have somebody that supervises them in that instance. It might be a program manager. We also have some other kind of creative things that are done across the state when collaborative MOUs with other organizations, supervisors to do some of that as well. So, but be specific on how the competencies are trained. Don't just say we do them and be like, yeah, we'll totally figure that out later when we hire somebody new because we haven't hired anyone in 5 years. Like, be specific, have a plan. And I guess that's kind of my next part here is create and utilize a training plan for all competencies and all trainings that are required. This just makes it so much easier, one, for you, because I'm looking here and I am thinking we've got maybe some new people new to the supervisor role. So like when you started, if the day you had started, would you have known what the expectation was, or how would you have known what the expectation was for a person that started maybe as a family support professional on the same day you did? How would you have known what the expectation was for them that you were kind of responsible for getting them trained? How did you know what all they needed to go and do? A training plan makes it easy. A training plan says, okay, this thing, yep, this is how we're doing it. This is the time frame. This is maybe who's going to observe that competency, which in the scenario I just provided makes it even trickier if you've got a supervisor who needs that to have that competency observed, and then they're supposed to be doing that for someone else too. But anyway, I digress. Just having a training and development plan is really key. I think that in the state, we've done a really good job with the Iowa Family Support Credential over the last several years of kind of making sure everything is included in there, making sure that some way, some shape, some form, whether it's on an onboarding form or a training form, or like that we're capturing all of these things, but like come up with a plan, like an official plan that is in advance, so that when somebody new comes on, yep, this is easy. I know what we're going to do. I know how, and you have to review that every so often, I think it's annually. But there's a whole standard that relates to this. So we're going to get to that. If you look at standard 2302, this is a standard that we have that's in the Iowa Family Support Standards that talks about that training plan. It's reviewed annually. It's revised in accordance with the assessment of the organization's training needs. It outlines specific expectations. Make sure it has faculty and trainers who are qualified and well prepared. It has all of those things. So if you've got to do that for 2302, why not just have that done now for standard 1401, 1402, 1403, standard 3.01, and really all of standard 24, like put them all in there. And then you can also put your own organizational or even program things that are beyond the things that relate to the Iowa Family Support Standards that maybe you want to make sure that staff have. Like you can expand on what's required for the Iowa Family Support Credential as necessary. It doesn't, but you can use that as a foundation to kind of start the process. And so just to kind of talk a little bit about what that training plan is it would specify this for each competency, how the competency is trained or how the competency is evaluated as met. So as a program, you can kind of pick. You can say, this is something that we really want to look at. We want to make sure that they have it. We want to have it observed. So maybe we send them to a training, but at the end of the day, when we check it off and say it's done, it's something we want to observe them doing. Or it can be that you say that they went to a training, great, done. However you want to do it. And you can go back and forth. So for some things you can say, this is the way we're going to do it. And then for the next one, you can say, okay, we're going to do it differently on this one. That's what that training plan would specify. Who observes the competency or evaluates the competency as met? If that's the way you go with it, make sure you're including that in there. Making sure that you include that like by when, or when will each competency be completed. For those that you say are going to be like they go to a training for, what training is that? Name the training. Or as staff, is it something that's done in-house? Like this is something that we're going to train within our organization? Or is it something that we're going to send them somewhere else to? We're going to send them to, Futures Without Violence or Bridges Out of Poverty, or whatever the training might be that would relate to that competency. Could be, you can kind of do that. And sometimes there'll be a competency that a couple of different trainings are what you're going to want to make sure that they go to a couple different. So it can be one competency, 3 trainings if you need to. And then where is the completion of the competency recorded? That's kind of that last piece to tie it all together for you, the program, and for the peer reviewers, because ultimately that's what they want to see, is they want to see that documentation of that completed competency. So the next slide I've got is kind of an example. And this one is obviously for the Iowa Family Support Standards because it has 3.01 up here. But so if you look here, you've got each bullet point from 1401, and this document's much longer. I just could only fit this little section on it. But it allows for that training or an observed competency. So really they can pick. For every one of those, they can say, okay, we're going to send this. If we've got somebody that comes in brand new, not worked in a program before, straight out of college, we're going to send them to the nurturing parent training, and that's who's going to be facilitating the training. Or it's going to be an observed competency, and it's going to be the program supervisor that observes that competency. So there's got to be, and then there's got to be like a checklist for like, how do you know that's done and that kind of thing. But it allows for either or, which is a tool, you can do that as well. That's up to you as a program to decide. Or you can specify, you can, have it be one way or the other, however you want to do it. You don't have to do competencies at all if you don't want to, or observe observations if you don't want to at all. So digging into then the practice part of things, the training development plan and those blank training logs, that's obviously going to be included in your box for practice. Want to make sure you include every competency. Big hint here would be to look at the training modules on the Institute, fsp.org, for staff that that are new and have not completed their certification yet. That would be one way you could do it. But really be thinking about how the Certified Family Support Certification, I messed that up on my acronyms, but how that exam can be used, because I do think that exam can be used in lieu of observed competency. It can be used in lieu of, I guess. So you can say, okay, this competency, we know that they have it because they've completed the Certified Family Support Professional exam. Like that can be how they meet it, which is kind of new from how we've maybe done it in the past. But I think that as a program, you get to decide that. There is not a completed crosswalk. I get that question a lot. If there's a completed crosswalk for that, there's not one officially out there yet. I would definitely on a program level be willing to talk to you about what could meet some things, but at the end of the day, it's going to be up to you as the program to say, you know what, I think this works. I think this matches. I think this, this all matches up. It's going to be up to you guys for right now. There's not like one that's like, okay, you got somebody that's met this, they automatically meet this. Like we don't have that yet. Talking about doing it, but right now it's up to programs. So other practice in there would be those completed training logs. Make sure you include every family support professional, supervisor, and manager in the program if applicable. One thing that is required for all of the training and competency standards is that completed IFSC training file checklist. That needs to be completed for all staff in the program. And then on that, it would document how the competency was met, either training or competency, the name of the training or the person who observed the competency and the date. I can get templates. I can get those checklists to you if you'd like. Keep in mind though, that not every standard is applicable for every program. So when you get that checklist, you might have to just kind of check off the things that aren't applicable to your program or program type. And then the last big one for this one is training materials content. So if you as a program, provide that training in-house, like within your program, or so within your program is probably the biggest one. You want to make sure that you are including agenda, slides, like PowerPoints or whatever, any evidence that's going to be necessary for the peer reviewers to say, yep, the content of that training meets that bullet point. For trainings that are outside of the organization, it's a little bit harder to do because for example, PAT, there's things that there's like parent educator resources, like things for parent educators to read. And then sending a person to the foundational training would be, really how they meet that. But then those parent educator resources are really good ideas to use as well, like verification. Some programs have used, well, we can talk, we can talk about how to do this for PAT in a way that's kind of cool and actually makes a lot of sense to me. Because PAT has got some cool things in there as it relates to making sure that that the family support professionals have the knowledge that they need in order to do their job. And then in that PHI portal, this would be the stuff that contains protected health information, would be the supervisor observations if they're documenting any sort of competency, is like anything that contains things that might be kind of like things you want to keep private or things that are might actually contain some protected health information. Make sure that on those, though, that you're labeling those standards where those standards are found at. Don't just leave things up to the interpretation of the peer reviewers, because their interpretation might be different than your interpretation. So some common missteps that we see for 1401. This one we see a lot, where we're getting better, I think, that the policy states that the program hires staff that already have these competencies. And so there's no real mechanism to cross-check those competencies that are listed on the resume or on their education, nor are there any interview questions that fully address any of the competency areas. So like, it's kind of one of those things like, how do you know? I talked about that earlier, but like, how do you know? Clarification would be like, programs must describe how each competency in the standard is met through either training or observed competency or education. Education is a little bit trickier because the competency should be more than a competency listed on a resume. If it says on a resume says like, yeah, I know how to do this, as you probably want to go more in depth on that one. If it's part of like a degree program, that would be common knowledge that the peer reviewers could like, yeah, that makes sense. For example, like a certified alcohol and drug counselor. Yeah, for sure. That might meet 1401, 1401I, which is, and then the very small portion of it that is recognize and address problems related to substance use. So like, yeah, that could work for that. But like, that makes sense that it's kind of common knowledge. But other than that, you don't want the peer reviewers to have to infer too much. And just saying like, we only hire people that have these competencies, duh, like that's not going to work. Okay, so we can breeze through 1402 because 1402 is a standard that only applies to home visitation programs that provide early intervention services, which presently there are none, nor have there. I think there's maybe been some before, but there's not any currently credentialed Iowa Family Support Program or Iowa Family Support credentialed programs that have this. So we're gonna skip this today. Standard 1403, again, a competency-based standard. However, this one's a little nuanced in that these are like parent education services provided in a group setting. So these would be applicable to programs, long-term home visitation programs that have a group component or group-based parent education programs. So if you're not doing groups as part of your program, the standard wouldn't apply to you or your staff. So these slides are exactly the same. This one is anyhow, as 1401, because really the approach to it is the same. Content, a little different. Competencies, definitely different. The approach on how you do it, how you plan for it, how you write it, outside of the competencies, pretty much the same. Making sure that, like thinking about it from that perspective of if you're a new staff member, how would you know what they needed to do? And then creating that training plan. Practice, also the same. On this one, it might be a little bit harder to find modules on the Institute that match up. And thinking about how the exam can be used might be a little bit more challenging. There are some things on group facilitation and things like that. The other place that you might be able to kind of lean on here is if you have a curriculum that has this built into it, like PAT has this built in, other ones do as well, but you can kind of lean on that curriculum a little bit more if there's like training for those competencies is part of that training for the curriculum. Really, this one, the missteps are the same as well. Where we see programs go wrong on this one is the same kinds of places where we see the S1401. I will say on this one, sometimes we've seen ones where programs hire very part-time individuals to facilitate like a group or a series of groups, and they hire from like the education world. So maybe they'll hire teachers or those kinds of things. Some of those competencies and like education do maybe relate a little bit better. It's a little bit easier to kind of, it would reason that somebody who is currently working as an educator has some of those skills. Although again, I still do kind of come back to that. How do you know for sure? So just be thinking about that as well. All right, so we're going to change gears entirely on standard 1404. These next couple ones are more supervisor supervision related, like the personnel within the program are, and as it relates to supervision and how those personnel, how those positions function. So first, we want to kind of establish the foundational requirements for qualifications for a supervisor when it comes to education and experience. So supervisors are qualified by an advanced degree in health, education, or human service field, bachelor's degree with 2 years experience, or an associate's degree and 4 years of experience. So as we look through there, 2 of the 3 require experience, and the last one under the associate's degree is, does require that supervisors require ongoing education and training opportunities. Yeah, that's kind of inferred. That probably happens in every program. But you definitely want to make sure that you speak to that in your policy and procedure. The interpretation, though, is on that last one. When supervisors are qualified by that 3rd bullet, prior experience with supervision is desirable, not required, but like definitely just want to, it's something that we would weigh strongly on. There is a whole process to a waiver for standard 1404. This one's a little tricky, and we'll get to it here in a little bit, but waivers are only granted for a program once in the program's whole existence, like ever. So if the program is given a waiver or was given a waiver previously for a supervisor, and that supervisor has left the program and they hire a new supervisor, that supervisor has to meet this standard. They cannot apply for another waiver. Because essentially then it would be like you didn't follow your own policy when you hired that new supervisor. It's kind of one of those things where we kind of grandfathered people in at the beginning, maybe that had been in those roles for a long time, and made sure that they had the requirements of it then. But now going forward, since the implementation of the Iowa Family Support Credential in like 2009, you programs have to make sure that they're hiring in ways that meet this standard. And the standard hasn't changed since the beginning. So do want to define supervisor. It's a position or positions responsible for facilitating supervision. Those responsibilities might be split between multiple positions depending on the structure of the organization or the program. Programs should define how the position is structured for their program and organization and policy. So if you split it, make sure you've got a policy and procedure that talk about how it's split and what duties are assigned where. Make sure that's really clear for peer reviewers that they know, okay, like this thing going to be handled by this person, this thing going to be handled by this person. A lot of times it'll be like organizationally, like PTO and time off and, performance, and all of those things are handled by like an administrative supervisor. And then the family level stuff, like making sure you get everything done, making sure that, you're talking about goals and providing that like family specific supervision is done with another person. So if that applies to your program, make sure you're doing a really good job of showing the peer reviewers how that's split out, but ultimately both apply here. And this is applicable to every program, long-term home visitation, both with or without group-based parent education programs and short-term programs. So for policy and procedure on this one, again, this is another standard where policy and procedure is probably going to look very similar, because your policy is going to be, we hire supervisors that have these qualifications, and then your procedure is just going to be a little bit of elaboration on that. So it could be that they're separate, but it also could be that they're kind of together. So what is the educational requirement for supervisors? Be specific for all the possibilities. I know that there's lots of different possibilities that could play out. And so make sure you're including all of the ones that are applicable for your program. You're not required to, just because this one allows for 3 different levels of education does not mean that you have to use all 3. Your policy can be, this is kind of one of those standards, it's like at a minimum, but your policy can be more strict than that. So if you only want to have supervisors that are bachelor or master's level, great, that works. And then also in your procedures, you want to definitely nail down how that educational level is verified. Let's see here, making sure that you're part of your process to either moving somebody into a supervisor role or hiring a supervisor from outside the organization, making sure there's a process to verify in that educational level. And then that also that that verification is not just a diploma that says Bachelor of Arts, that it's like something that says the degree field. Because if you remember, the standard does talk about, you know, health, human services, or education. I don't remember. Yes, health, education, or human services field. So making sure that you're verifying that component of it, because that will be verified as part of the peer review. I know sometimes there are degree paths, degree fields in the state that get a little like, I don't know. If that's the case, talk to me. We can talk through it. You know, sometimes if it's something, I had one that was like I can't remember what it was, but it sounded like it might not work, like it might not have been something that fell in one of those categories. But when we looked at we actually had them provide their transcripts, and when we looked at it, it was like, yeah, this would be a very much the same kind of educational topics that would be covered by many other human services type degree programs. Sometimes colleges just call things different things, and who knows why they do it. But and then we also sometimes have it come up with someone who has maybe an older, they went to college when something was called something different. The one we get a lot is at Iowa State, when things were called home economics before it was like child and family studies or whatever. Those can kind of get a little bit, in Iowa, we're familiar with how that works, especially out of Iowa State. So yeah, if you have any questions about that, or like kind of thinking through like, I don't know, talk to me, we can talk through it. And then I can also tell you if a waiver has ever been granted, so that you kind of know if you need to apply for one. Waiver applications can only be done during TA. So when you're in that renewal process and preparing, that's when that waiver comes through. That's when that's when you submit it. You can certainly be working on it ahead of time. In fact, I would maybe encourage you to start thinking about it ahead of time. Let's see here. What did I miss on this page? Making sure that you keep a copy of that verification of the specific degree field in the personnel files, so that you can present it for the peer review. For practice here, some things we might see we might see provided for that in that box would be job descriptions that state that educational requirement, evidence of the degree of supervisors, that would be that diploma or their transcript showing the degree field. A waiver, if applicable, making sure you plan that out, apply for it at least 9 months before the peer review. I'll tell you, the waiver application, I'm not trying to dissuade anybody from going that route if you think that might be applicable, but it is a lengthy process. It still involves you to go through you still have to go back on your education that supervisor has had, try, you know, all of the transcripts and say, okay, this class applied, this class maybe didn't apply. Go back and look at experience, supervisory experience that they've done before, what trainings they've taken, like just individual trainings that weren't necessarily part of like a college class. There's a whole formula for like, you have to it's kind of like a grant application. Everything's kind of like weighted, and then you do the math, and then has to be over a certain number in order for the waiver to be granted. And then some additional evidence might be like a program staffing chart that shows lines of supervision if things are kind of convoluted, and resumes of current supervisors, which would kind of show that like experience with, you know, previously working in or experience in the fields for each bullet point. Usually there's not anything in the PHI portal for evidence for this standard. Some missteps, or the only misstep really for this one, would be that the policy and procedure meets the standard, but the program did not provide, they provided a diploma, but diploma didn't cite the degree field. So just making sure that that's on there. A lot of times that we catch this, maybe actually the peer reviewers catch it in the peer review, and there's a chance to go back and like, hey, can you give me a diploma or show me evidence of like the degree field? And it's kind of a last minute scramble to get that done before the end of peer review, which is fine. You can certainly wait that long, but why would you? Like, if you can help it, plan ahead for it. Okay, standard 1405. This is the type of regular and support and supervision that are provided to staff members. So supervisors provide regular support and supervision to all direct service personnel. So like that's kind of that first statement, all direct service personnel or FS family support professionals get that regular support and supervision. And then supervisors provide additional support to personnel when they are new, experience or developing competencies, experiencing challenging circumstances with individuals and families or staff that they work with, or experiencing higher workloads. So if you've got staff that are in any one of those situations, additional support and additional support, maybe supervision might be required. Definitely want to describe how that works. When the word regular is in there, regular is a word that's kind of like a trigger word. You need to define that. What does regular look like? Is it weekly? Is it bi-monthly? Is it monthly? How long does it last? That kind of thing. Like those things all need to be described and defined out. The type of additional support provided to personnel is going to vary based on those unique needs and job responsibilities. For example, personnel might require more frequent supervision, additional training opportunities, reduced workloads, or shadowing for a period of time. Really just coming up with a plan. So like when we've got a new staff, this is what it's going to look like. When we've got someone who's still working maybe on their competencies or maybe haven't passed the exam, we're going to provide them some additional support. Maybe that looks like giving them some time to plan for their taking their test. When you've got staff that are experiencing challenging circumstances, what are some supports that are available to them then? It might be an EAP, through the organization, might be additional supervision. What does that look like? And then staff that are experiencing higher workloads, what supports are available to them? And again, that might be more increased supervision. It might be doing the supervision a little bit differently. Kind of just depends on the program, but you're going to need to explain each one of those things. And this standard is also applicable to all program types in the Iowa Family Support Credential. So for policy, we're going to be thinking about what does the program do? Why do they do it? So we're going to chunk this into two sections. We're going to talk about on the left-hand side, what regular support and supervision is available to all staff. So describe the various types of support and supervision. Those activities might include individual supervision, staff meetings, observations, like shadowing, work shadowing, like shadowing someone else. And that could be like just something that you regularly do. I think I always think it's a great idea. I know we typically do that for people that are new, but I think it's kind of cool to be able to, do that even for people that have been there 10, 15 years, because you always learn something by watching somebody else do it too. Maybe they do it differently than they do. Maybe they have a different approach. Maybe they have, everybody has different skills that they bring to the table. And so watching someone else with different skills do it might give you some ideas about how you can improve your practice. So I think that if you can, build that into something that's just done with everyone, that's just part of the process. That's a really cool thing to do. And then the other piece of things would be that additional regular support. And I threw and supervision in here because I think that's absolutely should be part of some of these pieces. The new developing competencies, experiencing challenging workloads or circumstances, like maybe additional supervision isn't necessary for everyone and every situation there, but it might be for some of them. So this is in addition to that of the staff that already the regular. So this is in addition to each bullet point could look the same. You could say, okay, so for anyone that is new, developing competencies, experiencing challenging workloads or circumstances, they get this. This is the thing we do. Or it could be different. You could break down each one and say, okay, for new people, we're going to do this. For developing competencies, we're going to do this, and like chunk it out. It could be whatever. And then make sure that you're defining, what does new mean? Is it people that haven't passed the Iowa Family or the Certified Family Support Professional exam? Is it people that are in their first 6 months of working there? Is it people, what is new? What does developing competencies mean? I've seen a lot of programs lately define developing competencies as individuals who haven't passed their Certified Family Support Professional exam. I think that's a great way to use that exam. And especially because you can kind of then give them some extra time and that additional support to be working on that. That could be some of the additional support, is allowing them some extra study time. Yeah. And then for procedure, we want to talk about who's involved in the process and their specific roles. How is information like collected, or where does all that information and documentation live? So for this standard, documentation really is a must. Which I see a lot of times where programs just want to say, yeah, we do it. Of course we do it. You're like, but you got to actually do it. Where is each component of regular support and supervision documented? If we think about it, there might be different things that come up in different places. So that regular support and supervision is going to incorporate components from 4.03, 1406, which we'll talk about in a second, 2501, 2503, and 2507. So as you're kind of putting this whole like supervision piece together, one, I think you're going to have to be comprehensive in how you think about supervision and make sure you're including everything that's necessary there. But two, making sure that the documentation is whatever way you document supervision, that it includes the elements for all of those things. Gone are the days where we can just write a supervision date down and be like, done, cool, we good. We need to be making sure that all of these components are included, because, if we don't document it, it's up to the peer reviewers to figure out, okay, like, how does it happen? And if the family support professionals aren't really able to like give them a clear picture into that, and even then a panel interview is kind of, sometimes it's there's a lot of content to get through and people don't explain things maybe as thoroughly as you would like for them to. So you don't want to rely on that. We want to make sure that there's documentation of it. It could also mean, those staff meetings. So again, documentation, if you say you're going to do it in a staff meeting, how do you document that? Keep meeting agenda minute, or like keep as in save your meeting agendas or your meeting notes. Like if you're going to keep notes after the meeting or whatever it is. I've seen handwritten scribbles. I've seen like formal typed out meeting minutes. I don't care what it is. Well, okay, handwritten scribbles maybe a little bit difficult to ascertain. Like handwritten is fine. Brief notes, fine. Just make sure that like you've cut some sort of documentation and that you're doing that on a regular basis. Observation, if part of your support is through observation and feedback, making sure that you're, those tools that you're using or those checklists that you might use for different things, making sure that that's included in there. The other big one here is for peer reviewers is that they're going to be calculating the number of completed supervisions out of the number of expected supervisions. So if your regular support and supervision is monthly supervisions, meaning once a month, and their peer reviewers are going back 6 months, they would expect 6 completed supervisions, right? And so they look back and maybe they only see 4. That's 4 out of 6, that's 66%. That's not meeting the standard. So definitely making sure that there's documentation of the supervisions. And that's, I think, that's not really new. That's always been part of it. But then, it gets a little bit trickier when we've got new staff in there, right? So that's why it's important to define who a new staff, like what new looks like, so that peer reviewers can say, oh yeah, this staff member, their hire date, because they're going to have that from the staffing grid, their hire date was this. They're new. So they're still in there for 6 months. So if I go back 6 months, I calculate and their number of expected supervisions is X, their number of completed was X. And so then they can say like so many out of so many, Yeah, and that's how they calculated that. So the big one there is, how will peer reviewers know kind of that assigned frequency of supervision? I would recommend putting that right there on the supervision form, or having a spreadsheet where you track that, or somewhere that you can provide that as evidence to the peer reviewers. Don't just leave them to guess it, because you never know what they're going to guess, and they may guess wrong, or they may interpret that wrong, or their perception of something might be different than your perception of something. For practice, things you'll want to include in your box: blank supervision forms, those staff meeting agenda notes, blank observation forms, and then the job shadowing documentation. So if you have job shadowing going on as part of that regular support, and then like maybe you come back and you talk about like, hey, what'd you learn? What worked? What, like, what'd you see that you liked and that you'd like to incorporate, like whatever that looks like, those forms that are completed would be in your box as well. In the PHI portal, it would be those completed supervision forms. And that includes, again, supervision forms of supervisors who carry a caseload. And then completed observation forms would be those, like the observation, of a staff member maybe doing the job, and then feedback and discussion and kind of, the growth that comes with that. Common missteps for 1405, that the program policy and procedures does not differentiate how support and supervision is different between all staff and staff that are new, or the other bullet points there. Supervision documentation does not provide evidence that supervision happens more frequently in those situations. So just to be clear, your policy cannot just be like, we provide regular support and supervision, bam, done. Nope, it has to be different. You have to describe what that looks like and how that works for your program. And kind of the last little piece that I wanted to provide to everyone here is that, like, I know I was a supervisor in a program, like I get it. Supervision documentation is hard. It is super hard. And I've seen lately where, and I know this is for myself, like if somebody just stops in and is like, hey, I got a question on this, can we like troubleshoot this family for 5 minutes? Yeah, that's fine. Like, let's do it. But it's hard to get that documented, right? So if your system for supervision is that like you're relying on that documentation of those open door situations for the standard to be met, set up a system now for how your system's not going to rely on those, how you're going to do what you need to do without relying on those open door situations. Because I would say nearly 100% of the time, I did not document those, despite having numerous mechanisms in place to try to. It just didn't happen like it should. Try maybe more frequent but shorter supervision sessions. Maybe try doing, I had to do weekly supervisions for the program that I worked in. So if it was supposed to be, it was supposed to be once a week, and I chunked it into 2 30-minute sessions. Where, hopefully we got a chance to talk about those more crisis situations. And so they actually got documented. Use spreadsheets to ensure that all families are discussed, and that to ensure the frequency of supervision is met. And the last one is kind of just that, like, decide, you've got to make a decision. It's got to be a conscious decision that you're going to prioritize supervision. We all know it, like, we know it's hard to get done, like to document, not that it's hard to do the supervision, but to document it. So do it with purpose. And I really like that work harder, not smarter. To me, that resonates. I know that seems like a cliche phrase to some people, but to me, it resonates, because I am that person who will invent a better way to do something for me, instead of just relying on every other way to do things. I need it to work for me. If it doesn't work for me, it's probably, not going to happen. I'm probably not going to do it. So it has to work for me. And I have to create things that work for me and systems that work for me. Okay, we're going to try really hard to get through the rest of this on time. I apologize. 1406 talks about the employee workloads, and employee workloads support the achievement of positive outcomes. They're regularly reviewed and are based on assessment of the following. So again, regularly reviewed. Talks through all of the different bullet points here, that it considers the qualifications, competencies, and experience. It considers case complexity and status, the work and time required to accomplish assigned tasks, including those with other job responsibilities, whether services are provided by multiple professionals or team members, and then service volume, so the need of those families. Case complexity can take into account the intensity, travel time, family, goal of the case, all of those things about the family that make them different and make it be like, well, some visits take me an hour, some visits take me an hour and a half. It takes me a half-hour drive there. It takes me 5 minutes to drive there. Like all of those situations, having, making sure that you're talking about workload, reviewing workload, there's documentation of that review done at the frequency that you say it's going to be done. This is applicable to every program except for programs that are exclusively group-based. So what goes into determining the workloads? Again, travel time, FTEs of the family support professional or other job responsibilities, case complexity, frequency of visits, other work things that they might do. So if somebody's also responsible for planning group events or facilitating a group event, that might take time off of their time to do all the other things. This is where we want to consider that plan service capacity. And so for those of you that have submitted your annual update forms, we talk about plan service capacity on there. Workload, plan service capacity, they all kind of tie together. How many families can the whole program serve at one point in time? So your workload is kind of factors into that. And reviewing those workloads factor into that. Define that regularly reviewed. What does regularly mean? That means you're going to tell us how frequently. Do you do it monthly? Do you do it? I would hope monthly at the minimum. I was going to go quarterly, but I really think that monthly is probably more where that needs to be. And then describe the correlation between how you achieve how the program achieves positive outcomes for the families and the workload. So I hear a lot of times, well, there's just one of us, there's only one family support professional. Like, it is what it is. Like, there's no really any assessment to be done of that workload because there's only one of us, and we have to take, so many families. So whatever. But I think there's ways to balance those things. So if you think through it, there's travel time, specific family needs. Travel time, you don't have a lot of control over. Specific family needs, you don't have a lot of control over, but you can kind of move some things around. Talk about what families might change for frequency. Maybe you're seeing them weekly now. Maybe they're ready to be seen bi-weekly. Parent group facilitation, maybe there's some things that can be shifted around there. Other job responsibilities, maybe, I know some programs during like county fair season, that's wild times and they don't have a ton of time, but maybe there's slower parts of the year too. So finding that balance and how we can still be talking about workloads and why it's still appropriate to talk about workloads even when you've got only one family support professional in a job or in a program. For procedure, where is the workload review documented? For each element, there should be a mechanism to document that somehow, some way, if it's needed based on how your procedures worded. Workload review needs to be done per family support professional. So there should be documentation of regular review for each family support professional. Workload review does not mean like, I just look at the program. Like, you need to be breaking it down on a family support professional level. It can be done as part of supervision. Lots of programs do, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. Describe then the role of the supervisor and the family support professional in the process. I've seen where family support professionals prepare the workload review in advance and bring it to supervision to discuss, where they kind of talk through that, supporting achievement of positive outcomes, or the family support professional and the supervisor complete them together during the supervision. Either way works just fine. It does not work to have, though, the supervisor just doing it on their own and not ever talking about it with a family support professional in a way that like doesn't facilitate those conversations then about like achieving positive outcomes. Like the tie back has always got to be to that supporting positive outcomes. How can we get families what they need? How can we make sure that everybody's getting their needs met? Family support professional in terms of work-life balance and just balance in general, but then also that the families are getting what they need out of the program. For practice, usually we see blank supervision forms in there, blank workload review forms. If you need to know, some or need to see some examples of workload review forms, let me know. I'd be glad to send some examples to you. I was looking through them and I don't really have any that are like appropriate for just general distribution to anybody and everybody, but I do have, maybe some that are a little bit more specific to each program that I could help you out with. You might need to look at curriculum model guidance. Some curriculums will have some additional guidance in there. And then, can everybody hear me okay? I've just got a weird pop-up box. I don't know why. And then blank workload review tracking. So tracking sheet or a spreadsheet that documents all the times you've had those workload reviews and that it's occurring at the determined frequency. That's just a really easy way for the peer reviewers to see that it's done. And then in the PHI portal, completed supervision forms, completed workload review forms, and completed tracking of those workload reviews. The biggest one we see on this one is there's just no documentation of it. I'll be really honest with you. What we've seen some in the out of adherence ratings have been, yep, policy and procedure says it's done. Family support professionals, they say it's done in the panels. However, or they talk about it at supervision or at group meetings, but like it's not written down. And then, but absent that documentation, the peer reviewers have no way of really knowing for sure. And really part of that is that frequency, that regular, how do you know that how do they know that it's done every single group supervision? And really group supervisions are kind of like that. Maybe you're talking about where the next couple of referrals might go if you've got a lot of people in your program, but like probably, I mean, that's not the way to do this to meet the standard, just because you need to be talking, how you tie that back to achieving positive outcomes for the families. It's not, and it's also, yeah, again, they just can't tell how frequently. So very quickly moving through standard 1407, which is it's an easier standard. It doesn't look like that way from this one. When multiple providers are involved, a team approach is used to ensure a comprehensive integrated approach to service delivery. So this standard is NA for organizations that don't involve multiple providers in service delivery. However, this standard is rarely NA, and it will, if you think that it should be, that it might be NA for your program, talk to us in TA. We'll talk through that. It used to be that the standard was NA a lot, and now as we've kind of refined the intent, there's really not many reasons for why it shouldn't be. This standard is different from standards 8 and 9. The intent of the standard is for collaboration on service delivery among providers. For example, like mental health professionals, maybe FADS programs, AEA, and is not just for providing referrals to families. It's applicable to all programs that are Iowa Family Support, that receive the Iowa Family Support credential. So on this one for policy, we're going to be thinking through like what is done with other service providers for service delivery. Maybe through a release of information, maybe through an MOU with the other service providers, and think about inside your organization and outside your organization. I think the outside is really easy to kind of wrap your brain around because AEA, that's the one we see here the most. Sometimes FADS, sometimes mental health professionals, sometimes, depending on the community, different other things, but like inside the organization as well, especially if you're an organization that provides a lot of various services to children and families. Think about therapy, think about other types of programs that might be available. There's just, yeah. So consider what is done differently when the family support professional needs to collaborate versus like just making a referral. Collaboration and it means, you're talking together. You're making sure that you're talking about like, what are you doing? How can we make sure we're staying like in our lanes and in our silos in a way that really integrates and then builds up, all of the services that the family is receiving. Or maybe talking about like, an issue that came up that you need to talk through with the FADS worker about, I don't know what, maybe you need some additional, help on something, or whatever it could be, especially in the mental health, when you're collaborating with mental health providers, sometimes it's like, hey, what's the best way to talk about this with this family, you think? Consider the purpose of the programs that are being collaborated with. So that might look a little different between AEA and FADS. Obviously, their purpose is different there. So that collaboration might be different between the two. Where are these documented? Again, the biggest one for procedure is always going to come back to documentation. It's going to come back to, you know, what the specific steps of things. So participant files, maybe where you would document collateral contacts. Make sure that the specifics on the conversation is documented and not just the date, the time of the conversation and who the conversation was with. I see that a lot where they'll just be like, talk to AEA, and they'll just put the date and the time. In order for the peer reviewers to kind of see that full collaboration and how that affects, or how that's, you know, working on service delivery, integrated service delivery, they need to see the content of the conversation and not just that there was a conversation. You know, the one thing I would say for caution is you'll want to make sure you're reviewing legal requirements for case consultation between providers outside the program and really inside the program as well. You know, making sure that one, you have a release of information, making sure that it falls within the parameters of the MOU, if there is one, and also making sure that like it's not more than is necessary for the integrated service delivery. Like it's not just like a, hey, let's go out for lunch and talk about this family kind of situation, especially mental health providers. And, you know, even when you've got mental health providers in your own organization, you want to, you'll want to check and make sure to see if a release of information is required. I would, you know, for me, I always come from that framework of like, does the family know that we're sharing information and we're collaborating? If the answer is no, you want to make sure that the family, you want to bring them in on it. The last thing we want to have happen is to have that collaboration, which is really intended to build families up and to make sure that like really good services are being offered by all programs. We want to make sure the family knows about it. The family should know about it. And so we should be talking about that with them, and we should be getting a release of information. But we want to make sure really, really clear we're clear on legal requirements, HIPAA requirements, all of those things. So it's always a little alarming when, you know, I hear that like, oh, that's cool, I just talked to the therapist in my office about this family. Like we both see them. It's like, no, but like, what? Like, let's talk about this. Like, why is that okay? Like it doesn't really work. I don't think it works that way. I'm curious sometimes how a program could see that works. I don't know. For practice, MOUs would be included in there. Blank releases of information, making sure that those blank releases are for like that reciprocal exchange of information, which would be necessary for collaboration. Blank consultation notes or case notes on those collateral contacts. Team meeting notes. This is one that is kind of interesting, you know, showing that education about collaboration with. So like explaining, talking about in team meeting or staff meeting, like, you know, this is what FADS does, and explaining that. Maybe having somebody from the FADS program locally come and talk to you so you can kind of establish that foundational like understanding of, hey, this is who we are, and hey, this is who we are. But then also, you know, maybe even collaboration together about how, like when we're working with AEA, this is what AEA is going to do, and this is what your program is going to do. You know, if there are team meeting notes or there's anything that really speaks to that, that would be something that you could include in here. In the PHI portal, it would be those completed releases, completed case consultation, or completed case notes on collateral contacts that are like family specific. Missteps for 1407. The one example I saw over and over again as I was looking through the times that this was out of adherence. Program's policy on procedure discusses procedures for making referrals to other service providers, but does not address that like collaboration for an integrated service delivery. Evidence was not provided that collaboration occurs for families individually or at a program level. So again, the intent of the standard is not for making referrals, just not for just making referrals. It isn't a reciprocal, that exchange of information back and forth. Maybe you're having monthly like calls to just kind of staff the case and make sure you're all on the same page about things. But it's that purposeful planning of integrated service delivery, whether that means like specifically for a family, or sometimes just that like check in with another program, like, hey, we've got a couple of families that we're both serving, it sounds like let's talk about how we can do this together in a way that's going to work for all those families, whatever that could look like. Okay, so that's done. Do want to just a quick update. I'm going to stop my recording now.